Welcome to another episode of Roads to Equity, where there are many paths, but only one destination. Our conversations unapologetically elevate BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ leadership. I am your humble host, Dr. Dwight E. Rhodes, and we're extremely excited to bring you today's show, Transforming Education, Lessons on Identity, Leadership, and Equity. Our guest, Vernon James-Riley, is an educator, leader, and equity advocate whose journey from a low-income background to a national leader in education exemplifies resilience and vision. With roles like Vice Provost at Relay Graduate School and Principal at Uncommon Schools, Vernon has led transformational initiatives, including driving double-digit academic gains in schools. Currently pursuing his doctorate at Harvard University, he's reshaping leadership and equity in education. In this episode, we'll explore his strategies for inclusive leadership, insights on navigating intersectionality in education, and his vision for equitable systems. Stay tuned for an inspiring conversation packed with actionable insights. But before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to Roads to Equity for more inspiring conversations with BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ leaders making a difference. Now, let's jump into our conversation with Vernon. So we can just dive right in with who are you and what brought you to this space of where you are in your career and the work that you're doing to impact student learning outcomes?
Great. That's a great question to start with. Thanks, Dwight. So, who am I? Well, my name is Vernon James-Riley, but in this conversation, you can only call me Vernon because the only person who called me Vernon James was my grandmother, particularly when I was in trouble. And I don't plan on getting in trouble on this podcast.
You never know what's possible in this podcast.
Yes, no, it's not. I'm no trouble for me anyway. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I identify as a Black gay man, Christian, a Northerner from New York City. Even though my family roots are in the South, but I am from the North. I grew up, low income, we would say poor, and through education have worked my way into the middle class, which feels good. And is really a large part of the reason why I am on the journey that I have been on for the past 15 years as an educator. So I mentioned my grandmother already. Her name was Ruby Vernell, so I'm named after my grandmother. She was from South Carolina, born in 1920. Very different time. She was the seventh of 14 children. She used to tell me stories of like walking 4 miles each way to a one-room schoolhouse where kids from like 5 years old to 14 years old all went to school together in one place. So just very different, right, than the type of educational experiences I have had and that we envision our American children will have. And I think because my grandmother didn't get a quality education, she kind of like knew it limited her life outcomes. And when she adopted me at 6 pounds and had the chance to raise a second generation of children, she was like, you are going to get the best education I can provide for you. And so my grandmother sacrificed, worked well past retirement. She did all types of odds and ends. She cleaned homes, she babysat children, she ran errands, she cooked food. She did whatever she had to do to pay for me to go to Catholic school. Because she didn't think that the traditional public school across the street was good enough. She didn't think it was going to give me the education I deserved. And so that was kind of the first time that even though I didn't have the language back then as a young child, the first time that I recognized that like educational inequity was a thing, and that not all schools were created equal. I'm grateful for my grandmother's sacrifice. Because of it, I was able to be the first in my family to go to and through college. But I think about all of the kids who look like me, who come from communities like mine, who went to that school across the street, that just wasn't good enough. And so when I, came of age and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I thought about my teachers and my schools, and I said, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to create more educational opportunities for kids, particularly who look like me and come from communities like mine. So I started my career as a social studies teacher. I served as a dean of students and a director of operations on my way to becoming a middle school principal. And then more recently, I have been a trainer of principals and school and district leaders all across the country, which has been an awesome experience to be able to touch so many different communities and to really help leaders think about what their community needs and how they can be the best leader they can be for the children and families they serve. So that's where I'm at now. And I came to Harvard because I was interested in exploring instructional leadership at scale. And that's kind of what I've been trying to figure out for the past 3 years of being at Harvard, of what would it really, really look like to change the game for kids all across our country through high quality teaching and learning.
Love it. I absolutely love that intro. And you've given us so many hanging chads in which to like latch on to. I'm really curious about the dichotomy between the school that you attended, that your grandmother said, this is the school that you're going to attend versus the one across the street. Like, do
Yeah.
you think that had you gone to the one across the street, what your path might have looked like compared to what it is? And I know we can't argue a
Yeah.
counterfactual, but I think you've been in this educational arena long enough to use evidence to support your answer. So I'm curious.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And like you said, of course, we can't know the answer for sure. Um, I would like to think that even in our lowest performing schools, there are hardworking teachers who really love children and are doing the best that they can for kids.
Mhm.
And that there would have been at least one, right, teacher even if the school was not as great as we would have wanted it to be, that there would have been at least one teacher who might have been able to see some potential in me to take me under their wing and kind of make sure I was good. Do I know that would be the case? I can't say for sure. Is that one teacher responsible for all kids? No, right? So like that's kind of why the whole educational inequity thing really sticks with me because I I wouldn't want to have been the exception. And that's what I was in many ways, right? Like, yeah, this one person who is Black, who is poor, is able to navigate the system. So that shows to us that the system can work, but the system isn't actually working for the majority. And so I think if I had gone to that school, I still may have become successful in my own right. But I still think about all those other kids who may not have, right? So that's what I think.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I also think about the intersectionality of your leadership
Mhm.
and your identity markers and what
Mhm.
impact that's had in getting to where you are today and where you hope to be in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think being Black and growing up poor,
Mhm.
but being, for lack of a better word, gifted as a student really helped me sort of like navigate and find success, right? It was easy to sort of like stick out in a really positive way that got me like positive attention and benevolence in a lot of ways. Like I was always like, a scholarship recipient, or I was always, someone was always trying to create an opportunity for me because I was a shining student who had this story of adversity.
Mhm.
Um, and what and again, I keep coming back to this idea of I am grateful, right, that it worked for me in that way, but it just doesn't work for everybody in that way. And so I think at least growing up, particularly before I got to high school, those were the two identity markers that mattered the most, that I was like Black and poor.
Mhm.
And of course, I didn't come of age, quote unquote, until I got to high school and then to college. But growing up, I think those were the two identity markers that really kind of like put me on a path of like, actually, you can go to college and you can find success professionally and you can kind of like build the life that you want as an adult. Because you're kind of like this shining example of what we almost like the token Black, for lack of a better way to say it, right? Like, this is like, you're the shining example of what we want. So we will like help you find success.
Tokenism is real. And
Absolutely.
that's a conversation we can go on that pathway as well. But I want to go back to the identity marker of being queer,
Yep.
LGBTQIA. Like,
Yep.
at what particular point did you understand that identity marker as a part of who you are and who you wanted to be to the world or show to the world?
Got you. Um, so I wouldn't say that there was a particular point.
Okay.
Um, like I know many folks will tell of like a like quote unquote coming out story. I never I never really had a coming out because I kind of was just always who I was. Um,
Okay.
even when I was younger, like preteen,
Hmm.
before I like knew about any type of physical or romantic attraction, like before I had even hit puberty, I always was just a little quote unquote different compared to the other boys.
Hmm.
So I like if we had to say like there's a spectrum, if you will, of like femininity to masculinity, if we want to work on that binary for just a second, just for the sake of this story, I would have been more to the feminine side. I, the boys would always be playing basketball and I would be jumping double dutch with the girls, or like I was not a boy's boy, right? Um, so it's kind of just always who I was. And then as I became older, when I got to high school, I actually went to an all boys high school. And that was a fascinating experience that really sort of affirmed my identity in a lot of ways. And yes, there was some minor homophobia being in an all male environment and being like a more feminine guy. But what I also found in that environment was a set of friends who we were all coming of age at the same time. And I'm still best friends with my three other high school best friends. We were all in the same class. We met freshman year, and that was like 25 years ago at this point. Like, we're still best friends. And so I think that I never like came out or had a moment that defined it. But if I had to think of a phase of my life that really defined who I became as a queer Black man, it definitely would have been that high school era. And the relationships that I formed with other Black gay men who were like finding themselves. I also mentioned that I grew up in New York City. And so New York City is a fascinating place to grow up as a queer Black person. Of course, there's like Greenwich Village and there's like the ballroom scene, and there's this whole sort of like queer culture that in the past 20 years has become more and more and more public. But I had, the wonderful benefit of being able to grow up around that, right? And being able to kind of like have this core group and we're all kind of exploring together like what's going on out here. And we've got fun stories. We did some wild things as young adults, right? But it really helped affirm, oh no, like there are people out here like me who are like living in their full truth. And I think that was really affirming for me as a young person in my teens. Now, here's what I will say. I mentioned I grew up with a grandmother from the South, an
Yes.
older woman,
Hmm.
who was a God-fearing Christian woman. So the toughest part of being queer was to have had this maternal figure who adored me and whom I adored. And when I got to that high school age where I have now found this friend group and I'm now out exploring and experimenting and however you want to call it, and she is like, what the are you doing? Right? Like, this is not who you are. This is not what God wants for you. An interesting backstory that I didn't share is that my mother is also a member of the LGBTQ community. So my grandmother's only daughter
Oh, oh.
is only daughter, yes, youngest child and only daughter is a masculine presenting lesbian. And so my grandmother had already had this sort of one phase, if you will, of heartbreak, quote unquote, with the fact that her like beautiful daughter wants to be a man, which is not actually what my mother wants, right? But like they had already had this strained relationship as my mother came into her own identity. And then it was sort of like I was like a repeat, like salt on a wound almost. Like, I can't believe you are doing this too. So my grandmother and I, those teenage years were really rough. There was a year when I like actually moved out and went to live with my mother. Which like wasn't the best living arrangement just because it was like a one-bedroom apartment. I was a 16-year-old boy, but my relationship with my grandmother had just gotten so tenuous that it was like, this is not going to work. Like, something is up, it's not going to work. And so I was grateful that my mother, was in a place where she was like, just come, like, we'll figure it out. Now, to the point that I made earlier about education kind of canceling it out, um, and maybe canceling it out is not the right word or the right phrase, but like education sort of sometimes overshadowing my queerness is when I got into college, and I went to Yale for undergrad. And I think my grandmother realized that I was going to be fine in life. It
Mm.
all kind of like settled down. Now, part of that could have been like she was getting older. She eventually, struggled with dementia before she passed away and all of those things. So maybe some of it was just like she was starting to lose her faculties. But my perception of it as a young person was as soon as I got into college and it was clear that I was going to like make something of myself, she was perfectly fine. And now she would still ask me silly questions. Like I had a really close a friend, a really close friend, a young woman who I met in college, and she would like come to my grandmother's house and stuff like that. And my grandmother would be like, "When are y'all gonna have babies?" and stuff like that. She would still say like very heteronormative things, and I'd be like, "Now you know, like this is not what this relationship is, right?" But it just wasn't as tenuous as it was. So it was a hard period in my life for sure. Um, but again, it to me, at least my perception of it was once it was clear that I was not throwing away my life by being a gay man. I was not going to be in the street doing crazy stuff. Like I actually was going to go to school, get a degree, get a job, etc., which is really what she wanted for me. She kind of like calmed down in an interesting way based on how she was taught to interpret the Bible, right? That this lifestyle, quote unquote, is wrong, it is sinful, you're going to go to the pits of hell. Like that's what she believed. um and I also thought there was a part of it where she was fearful. Like I really thought she believed that just by nature of being gay, I was going to somehow fall victim to something and I was not going to like find success. So I think I don't ever think she like resolved it. Now, it was interesting for me speaking about religion because it's funny you say Southern Baptist. My grandmother went to the Southern Baptist Church. I was actually baptized and raised Pentecostal. Um, and then I went to Catholic school. So like I believe in God. I identify as a Christian. I don't regularly attend church right now because sometimes the church can be tricky when it comes to the LGBTQ. Well, the Black church. The Black church in particular can be tricky
Mhm.
when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community. However, what I will say is I had two teachers who were very instrumental in me coming to understand that the way I have a relationship with God and what I interpret the Bible to say does not say just by nature of being gay, I'm going to hell, right?
Mhm.
Like, so I had my high school campus minister, who again, when I was in high school, never said that he was gay, but just that kind of I know you, you know me, kindred spirit situation, right? Like I just knew. And we're still in touch now. He's on Facebook. He calls my friend group his children. Like he is great. He probably doesn't even know the like level of impact that he had on me and us because I saw this like image of a Black man being his true authentic self and still loving God and still having an impact. And I was like, oh yeah, this is possible, right? And then I also had a high school choir director. She was a lesbian woman, um, who was in a lesbian relationship with a child and like is now a preacher, right? Like loved God. I was in her choir. We sang the songs of the Lord. Like, but at the same time, she was creating a space for us to, as young adults, be who we were, find ourselves, etc. And so I sort of lean more into the like love your neighbor version of the Bible as opposed to the fire and brimstone version. Right. So, and that's just kind of like where I am with it.
Well, this is your opportunity to acknowledge anyone who has had that pivotal impact on your life. And you just did.
I know, I know. Well, I don't know if they want their names out there like that. I don't know. But I will say, oh, go ahead. What would you say?
No, I'm just affirming that fact that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it is
I
done.
won't say nobody's names that may or may not want to be mentioned, but I will say, and if they watch the podcast episode, they will know who they are. But my high school campus minister, amazing, and my high school choir director, both super impactful in my life generally, but also, academically, self-esteem, owning my identity, and have both been instrumental in who I became. So I appreciate them both.
I absolutely love that as well because just a quick caveat about an experience I had as a teacher and my middle school principal. my direct boss was gay and living married to a man. And I had absolutely no idea. So when you said that, you've had people in your past and still currently, there's this kindred spirit and things are just sort of unspoken. Things remained that way between Mark and I for years. And it wasn't until after I had been a principal, after my work at the district level, that he and I had a conversation where we talked about who we were. And there was no cover, there was no pretense, there was no hesitation to just be real and have a truly transparent conversation. But it took years. I mean, when I say years, Vernon, it took years for us to get to that place. So
Mhm.
that resonates with me. And it also resonates with me when you share the quick vignette about your mother being gay, right?
Mhm.
Well, I come from a family of three boys, and all three of us are gay. I'm the youngest of three. So that resonates with me as well. So I want to talk a little bit because time is short, but I'd
Yeah.
love us to talk, or better yet, I'd love to hear from you. How has all of those experiences, all of those relationships, from your grandmother to your friend network in as a freshman in high school, to the impact of other people having on you once you made it out of high school, what role did that play with you in terms of your leadership ability and how you lead, not necessarily walking into a room and saying, I'm Black, I'm gay, I'm queer,
Right.
but just simply living and walking in your truth in a way that you don't feel as if you have to wear a mask or pretend to be something that you're not?
Yeah. 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 So I am grateful that I don't ever feel like I had the experience of wearing a mask. As I mentioned earlier, like I never had a coming out moment. I kind of just always who I was.
Mhm.
And thinking about my own experiences and the power of just a positive role model,
Mhm.
I think I have always tried to be that for the next generation of folks coming behind me who I've had the honor and privilege of being a teacher, a coach, a mentor, a principal, whatever the case might be. So whether it be like a student in my classroom, I can like think of specific students from like when I was a principal who I may have had that kindred spirit feeling like maybe this is a young person who's going to eventually come into their own. And it was important in my opinion, important for them to see a Black gay person as their principal, right? Like leading a school successfully with high expectations and belief in what was possible for them, encouraging them to go to college, encouraging them to pursue the life of their dreams, right? And so I think that has been the key way in which my queer identity shows up in my leadership, particularly as an educator, is just me being authentically who I am in a way that hopefully allows you to, as a younger person, know that it is okay to be authentically whoever you are or authentically whoever you are going to become. And so I would say that is the key way. I just always try to be a positive role model and be authentic in myself so that others know that it is okay to be the same.
So a huge part of why I'm having these conversations with leaders like yourself is that we are in this age of, don't say gay
Yeah.
legislation. So how then do you navigate the space of being authentically you, showing up as who you are, and not just a kindred spirit, because that suggests, wait a minute, we're not actually talking about
Mhm.
what we're feeling. How do you as a leader in today's context navigate that space when you feel like there is a kindred spirit here and a student might be willing to open up and ask or say things to you that if you were not gay, you would not be able to connect with? But you've got the legislative piece that says, wait a minute, depending on what state, you will lose your job and probably be prosecuted if you engage in a conversation that is much more than, I don't want to say touchy feely, but like kindred spirit. Like, how do you have explicit conversations or how would you have an explicit conversation around being queer in 2024
Yeah.
with a student or
Yeah.
teacher?
Yeah, it's extremely tricky. And I recently I mentioned I'm from the North and I recently relocated to Georgia.
Mhm.
And so I am learning how to navigate a different political climate and a different set of expectations. It's just different, right? So being my
Mhm.
previous experience in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, very left-leaning liberal states where everybody is pro, like be who you, not everybody, right? But like generally the sentiment is it is okay to be gay. It is okay to be LGBTQ plus, like be who you are. We support you. We support trans rights. We support queer rights, et cetera, et cetera. And now I'm like in a place where I'm like, that's not the case down here, right? Like it's just it's a little different. There's like a way to learn. What it makes me think about is what role do we play in advancing our causes,
Mhm.
and when is the time when I need to lead from the front, and when is the time where I may need to lead from the rear? And the reason I say that is because I think of a time, actually, this happened when I was a principal. Well, it's a two-part story. Um, Before I was a principal, when I was actually a teacher and about to be a principal fellow, is around the time when Michael Sam was like the first Black gay football player, something of that sort. Probably. So this is probably like 2013, 2014, something like that. And I remember I was again a teacher at the time, and the principal who I believe is an Indian, maybe let's say Middle Eastern woman. A Middle Eastern woman led a full community meeting with a group of fifth through eighth graders. So we're talking 10 to 14-year-olds, 350 of them, talking about why this was a monumental moment. And I remember thinking, this is fascinating because I don't know if I would be able to do that in the same way. Not because I don't believe it was a historic monumental moment that kids should be talking about, but because of the body that I inhabit and the identity markers that I hold, my intentions might be interpreted in a different way. So her as an ally, her ability to lead that meeting and no one blink an eye and call it an agenda would be different than if I did it. Fast forward a few years later when I became a principal, and I never said publicly to my students that I was gay, even though I'm sure many of them suspected it. But I always ensured that we celebrated World AIDS Day. And I remember, and like the kids would like pay $1 or $2 and they would like wear all red. And then we would donate the money to like, the World AIDS Fund. And I remember the first time that I had to like explain what AIDS was
Mm.
and why we were doing this particular celebration. And it meant a lot to me being of a community that was greatly impacted by this disease. And I kind of had to give that information to 10-year-olds in a way that they could understand. And I remember like ruminating over this presentation in a way that I had not about other things. I could stand up there and talk about Black Lives Matter all day, by the way. And we did, right? So like, George Floyd and all of those things, I was very clear, purposeful, direct with my students about police brutality, injustices. But when it came to this issue with this other identity marker, I was like, oh, this is touchy, right? Like I'm dealing with Black Christian families. I'm dealing with African conservative families here, right? So I have to quote unquote play my cards right in order to still advance my cause without it being seen as an agenda. And so I share these stories to say, back to kind of the original phrase that I used, there's a time when you like lead from the front, there's a time when you lead from the rear. There's also a time when you have to like lean on your allies and your co-conspirators to say, it actually might be dangerous for me to lead from the front in this moment because of the identity markers that I hold. And now is when I need you to step up. And so I think if I could have gone back and like done those moments, it's particularly that moment around World AIDS Day, a little bit differently, I think I would have called more on the other adults in my building who like who knew what was up and like knew what was going on. And I was feeling this pressure to lead from the front, but feeling the apprehension of the like dangerous place that I felt it was putting me in. When I had a community of folks that somebody would have stepped up and led that and not have had the same brunt. So bringing it to the present in today's climate, I think those are the things that queer leaders, and I would say leaders of other marginalized groups that are under attack need to be considering as well, is when do we lead from the front versus the rear, and when do we call in our allies and co-conspirators to advance the cause in a way that moves us forward without fully putting us completely in danger and at risk.
Right.
And some people would say you got to put yourself in danger and at risk to move the cause, right? Like that is some people's belief. So I think it's just about how you want to play it and how much you're willing to risk and how much you're willing to lose.
Yeah, so I really like that, and I'd like for us to dig in, take a few minutes to dig into that, because one could argue that what I'm hearing you say is that there's a time when leading from behind or in the back is actually having someone else do the heavy lifting of whatever the cause you're trying to further, right? Which I trust me, at this particular point, I totally get and I respect and I've done. So let's be clear about that, right? But
Right.
what would you say to someone who's like, to hell with that? I'm the person who identifies with X marker, identity marker, right? Just fill in the blank.
Mhm.
And I need to lead this initiative to the last point that you just made. Like, and it may just put me in harm's way. So, how then, what advice would you have to someone who has that point of view and wishes to do so and live that implementation of leading from the front with a particular cause that will probably put them at either career endangerment or physical danger? What
Yeah,
advice do you have, if
absolutely.
any?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there are individuals who that is their MO,
Yep.
right? And I think we
Right.
need people leading from all sides, right?
Mhm.
Like we can't just lead in one way to truly create the type of transformation we need to create in our country for marginalized groups. So um for folks whose sort of valence is to lead from the front, regardless of the dangers, I would say build in your community,
Mhm.
right? Like, who are the folks who are on the front lines with you so that it's not just you always taking the fall, taking the brunt, taking the pain, taking the trauma, right? Like, who's your community and your support system? Um,
Mhm.
what are your self-care practices? Because leading from the front is hard, difficult. It can be exhausting. If your name is getting dragged through the mud, if your job is in jeopardy, like those are challenging, traumatic experiences that some people believe are necessary for the cause, right? Like I think about the civil rights movement and people were like, I'm ready to go to jail. Right. There are people who like, I'm ready to get beat up on this bridge because this is a cause that I believe in and I need to lead from the front, right? So but I often think about those individuals and rarely, if ever, were they alone, right? Like I think about the multiple people who were sitting together at the Woolworths counter and being arrested together. Even Rosa Parks, we see her as an individual who put herself on the front lines, but that was a very coordinated, intentional effort with the backing and support of many Black people and organizations to say, this is the move we're going to make and we're all going to be ready, right? So I think it's, now that I'm processing it out loud, I think the cheat code to leading from the front is probably community
Mhm.
and making sure that you're not on the front line alone and that you have your folks at the ready to like be in it with you and support you. So I think that would be my advice if folks felt really compelled to lead from the front.
Love it. Absolutely love it. And there's never a right answer. The only
Yeah,
right answer is the one that you feel is coming from your heart. I have a couple of more questions for you.
sure.
One is, this is without all of our identity markers, without having sometimes, like we've discussed in this conversation, being a token. And I do not use tokenism as a negative because there are times when we are literally the only Black, gay, male with a certain intellectual wherewithal in the room. And we're there because of those things. And that, by sheer definition, is, some would say, representation. Old school would say tokenism. So,
Mhm.
how then do you self care, carrying so much, even with community? How does Vernon, soon to be doctor,
Yeah.
self-care?
Yes. So I would say, to the point of like community, I think for me, community is probably at the top of my like self-care routine, if you will, in that I find joy and inspiration and motivation and fulfillment in the relationships that I have with the people around me. I don't necessarily have the widest net, but I have a deep net, if you will, of folk who I am connected to, in contact with, and who I feel like we pour into each other, particularly when times are hard. And so that would be number one. Number two, I would say therapy and coaching works wonders. So I've had a couple of different either therapy and or life coaching and or executive coaching experiences in the past few years. In fact, I wouldn't actually have applied to Harvard had I not had an executive coach at the time. So I want to like that's another person I need to shout out. I'm not gonna say no names, but he knows who he is. My first ever executive coach out in Cali, who I thought he was going to help me be a better manager of people. That's what I thought was going to happen when I first got an executive coach as like a first time senior leader in an organization. And he was like, "What do you want to do with your life? Like, who do you want to be?" And I was like, "Well, I had this dream once of going to Harvard. And then the next thing I knew, I was applying and overcoming imposter syndrome. And then I was in, and then I was there, and I'm almost done." Right. So, like, I think having a qualified professional who is unbiased, who you can honestly just share your highs, your lows, your triumphs, your worries, and like be able to process that out loud is a form of self-care. Of course, exercise is key. I'm
Mhm.
trying to do that. I don't love the gym, but I go to the gym. I don't love yoga, but I do yoga because I know I should. So figure out what your thing is. But I think those would be my top three.
Okay.
Um, Especially like balancing right now, being a full-time student, basically being a full-time entrepreneur slash business owner, which is a new identity that I'm like coming to like accept and say out loud.
Mhm.
Um, but I have to try to take care of myself. And I think those are three of the ways that I do.
Beautiful. And so for the last question, and this is the one question that I've tried to ask all of our guests, and that
Sure.
is like, what type of world do you dream of that includes the LGBTQIA plus community,
Wow.
that's completely accepting, and what does it look like to unlock that world?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think a world that was truly and fully accepting of the LGBTQ plus community would be a world in which a member of the community would not have to think about their identity because it's almost like it's invisible. Not invisible hiding, right? Not that we're hiding in it being invisible, but that it just doesn't matter. Like, you don't have to think about it. Like, I don't have to think about if I go into this, you know, overly macho, quote unquote, environment, will people look at me a certain way or think something of me because I am not a macho person, or that a person who identifies as trans would not have to worry about if I go into this establishment, are they going to have a bathroom that's suitable for me? Is it going to be an issue if I go into this bathroom, right? So I think that's the world that I would love to see for the LGBTQ plus community. And I think that's unfortunately probably a long ways away. Um, but I think for some people who, and I can't speak for everyone, and I'm not in people's heads, but I wonder, I'll frame it as that. I wonder sometimes if folks who are anti-queer rights and anti-trans rights are threatened. And if so, by what? Like I'm curious. I don't know, right? Because I'm like, I don't agree with that viewpoint. I don't 100% understand that viewpoint. It's hard for me as a queer person. It's sometimes hard for me to even process what the alternative viewpoint is, but clearly many, many people in our nation and even our world hold an anti-queer viewpoint. And so I wonder, is it like, are you threatened? And if so, by what? Because we just want to be happy. We're just trying to live our lives just like you. We're just trying to like make something of ourselves just like you. We want to build families and homes for the most part, not everybody, but we want to build families and homes and have children who get an education. And, like, I think we want the same thing. So is it like, are you threatened that by us being able to attain those things, it's somehow taking away from you? I don't know. So I think that many people in our nation probably would need a huge mindset shift in order for us to truly pursue a world where one's sexual identity or gender identity was quote unquote invisible.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your absolutely amazing thoughtfulness and just being transparent in your thinking out loud and processing out loud. It's added to the voices that we're elevating so that we can unlock that world where it's no longer an issue, that one particular identity marker, and that is being a part of the LGBTQIA plus community, is no longer an issue for anyone. So thank you, future Dr. Vernon, for being a part of the conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I look forward. It's unfortunate, but we haven't actually met each other in person. So
I know. Soon. We got to make it happen.
definitely. With that said, be well and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.